Tuesday evenings were usually quiet in our house, a moment to breathe after the grind of work. I was on the couch nursing a beer when Lisa walked in, her face pale and eyes darting everywhere but at me. "Jim, we need to talk," she said. I muted the TV and turned to her. "What's up?" She sat at the edge of the chair across from me, twisting her wedding ring. "It's about Sophie." I straightened up. "Is she okay?" "She's fine. Physically." Lisa paused, and her lips trembled. "But I found out something disturbing." The tone sent a chill through me. "What are you talking about?" She exhaled sharply. "Sophie's been seeing someone. And it's not just anyone." My brow furrowed. "Who?" Lisa hesitated before whispering. "David. David Parker." The name hit like a punch to the gut. "David. Our neighbor. My friend." "What?" I said, leaning forward. Her voice broke. "Jim, it's worse. He's Sophie's biological father." I froze, every part of me rejecting her words. "What the hell are you talking about?" "I never told you because it didn't matter back then," Lisa said, her words tumbling over each other. "I was pregnant when we met. You've always been Sophie's dad in every way that counts. Not biologically, apparently." I snapped, standing up. Lisa flinched but pressed on. "I found texts, pictures." Sophie admitted it when I confronted her. My legs went weak, and I sat back down, staring at her in disbelief. "You're telling me she's sleeping with him? Her own father?" Lisa nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't know how to tell you. I thought I could fix it somehow." "Fix it?" I said, my voice rising. "You've been sitting on this for how long?" 3 weeks, she said, barely above a whisper. I laughed bitterly. Jesus Christ, Lisa. We sat in silence, the weight of her confession crushing the air out of the room. Upstairs, Sophie's music thumped faintly through the ceiling, a cruel reminder of how normal everything had seemed just an hour ago. "I need some air," I said, grabbing my jacket. "Jim, wait." But I was already out the door, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. Nothing about this would ever be normal again. The night air didn't do much to clear my head, but it gave me space to process Lisa's bombshell. I sat in the car parked at the edge of our cul-de-sac, staring at David Parker's house. The lights in his windows were on, and I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Rage simmered in my chest, but questions swirled even faster. How the hell had I missed this? I drove aimlessly for an hour before returning home. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the fridge. Lisa was in the living room, curled on the couch, looking up as I entered. "You left her alone?" I asked coldly. "She's locked in her room," Lisa said. "She hasn't come out since I talked to her earlier." I didn't respond. I walked upstairs and stood outside Sophie's door. The music was off, and I could hear faint shuffling inside. I knocked once. "Sophie." No answer. I knocked again, louder this time. "Sophie, open the door. We need to talk." A pause, then the sound of her unlocking it. She opened the door just wide enough to peek out, her eyes red and puffy. "What?" she muttered, her voice raw. I pushed the door open fully and stepped inside. "We're talking." "Sit." She hesitated, then sat cross-legged on the bed, hugging a pillow to her chest. I leaned against her desk, crossing my arms. "I don't even know where to start," I began. "Your mother told me everything." Sophie's eyes darted away. I figured, "What the hell is going on, Sophie?" My voice rose, and she flinched. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her lips trembled, but she stayed silent. "Why?" I pressed. Why, I couldn't even bring myself to say the word. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice barely audible. I laughed bitterly. "Not what I think. You're having an affair with David Parker, your biological father. What else could it possibly be?" Sophie winced, tears brimming in her eyes. "I didn't know he was my father at first. Mom never told me." Her words hit like a punch. "I hadn't expected that." "What are you talking about?" "I found out a few months ago," she admitted. "He told me." My stomach turned. "He told you? David?" She nodded, wiping her face with her sleeve. "He said he wanted to get to know me." "I didn't mean for this to happen, Dad, I swear." "Don't call me that right now," I snapped, the words harsher than I intended. "And what do you mean this? How long has this been going on?" Sophie broke down, sobbing into the pillow. I don't know. It just happened. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I stood there, my fists clenched, feeling every ounce of control slipping away. Stay in your room, I said finally, my voice low and cold. Do not come out unless I say so. Sophie nodded, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I left the room and closed the door behind me, leaning against it for support. My head was spinning, but one thing was clear. David had to be confronted. The next morning, I didn't go to work. I stayed home, pacing the kitchen, trying to piece together the timeline. Lisa sat at the table, looking like she hadn't slept. You said you found texts and pictures, I began, not bothering to look at her. Where are they? Lisa hesitated, then unlocked her phone and slid it across the table. I opened her messages and found the folder she'd saved. It was worse than I'd imagined. Texts between Sophie and David, full of affection and innuendo. Selfies from Sophie, innocent at first, then increasingly suggestive. And one photo of them together in what looked like his car. My grip tightened on the phone. How did you find this? I used the family phone plan, Lisa said quietly. I noticed Sophie's data usage skyrocketing, so I checked her activity. And you didn't tell me, I muttered, scrolling through the messages. I wanted to handle it myself, Lisa said, tears in her voice. I didn't want you to. To what? Lose my mind? I barked, throwing the phone onto the table. Lisa flinched, and I immediately felt a pang of guilt. But only a small one. I grabbed my jacket and headed for the door. Where are you going? Lisa called after me. To see him. David Parker answered the door with his usual easy grin. Jim, what's up, buddy? The sheer audacity of his demeanor made my blood boil. Without a word, I stepped inside, forcing him back into the hallway. Whoa, okay, he said, raising his hands. What's going on? You know damn well what's going on, I growled, my fists clenching. His smile faltered. Jim, I don't know what You've been sleeping with my daughter, I spat, my voice shaking with rage. Your daughter? David's face drained of color. He stammered, I didn't. Jim, listen. I grabbed him by the collar and shoved him against the wall. You listen to me, you piece of garbage. If you ever come near her again, I swear to God I'll... Wait! David gasped, his hands flailing. I can explain. Explain? I shouted, slamming him harder against the wall. Explain what? How you seduced an 18-year-old girl. Your own blood? He choked on his words, and I finally let him go, disgusted. He stumbled back, rubbing his neck. I didn't mean for it to happen, he said weakly. I got caught up. I stared at him, my anger momentarily giving way to disbelief. Caught up? In what? Your sick fantasies? David opened his mouth, but I didn't want to hear another word. This isn't over, I said coldly, stepping back toward the door. Stay away from my family, or I swear, you'll regret it. I slammed the door behind me, shaking with rage. Back in the car, I gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to calm the storm inside me. I couldn't let this go unanswered. Not yet. I drove home in a fog, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. David's excuses echoed in my head. I got caught up. Disgusting. Every word he said had been pathetic, empty. How could someone who once shook my hand and shared my table be capable of something this vile? When I walked into the house, Lisa was waiting, perched on the edge of the couch like a guilty child. Did you? She started. I talked to him, I said curtly, cutting her off. Her face fell. What did he say? Does it matter? I snapped. Lisa flinched but didn't respond. For a moment, the house was silent. We need to figure out what happens next, I said finally, pacing the living room. Sophie can't stay here if she's going to be this reckless. And I stopped myself, my anger spilling over. You let this get out of control. Lisa's eyes brimmed with tears. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to protect her. By keeping it from me? I shouted. By letting him continue? I didn't let him, she shot back, her voice rising for the first time. I've been trying to fix this, Jim. You just failed, I said, cutting her off again. Lisa crumpled into herself, tears streaking her cheeks. Part of me felt a pang of guilt, but it was quickly drowned out by the sheer weight of the situation. I spent the rest of the day avoiding everyone. Sophie stayed locked in her room. Lisa barely moved from the couch, and I worked in the garage, trying to make sense of my next step. By evening, I decided it was time to confront Sophie again. I knocked on her door, but this time I didn't wait for her to answer. I pushed it open to find her sitting cross-legged on her bed, staring at her phone. She looked up, startled. "We're talking," I said, stepping inside and closing the door behind me. Sophie didn't argue. She set her phone down, her face pale and tired. "I saw the messages," I said, keeping my voice even. Her eyes widened, but she didn't speak. "You think this is love, Sophie?" I continued, my tone sharpening. "You think what you have with him is real?" Her lower lip quivered. "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" I demanded. She hesitated. "I didn't know he was my father when it started. He said he cared about me, that he wanted to make up for lost time. And you believed him?" I said, incredulous. Tears welled in her eyes, but she kept her voice steady. "He was kind to me. You're always busy, and Mom is always on my case." I didn't feel like I mattered until she trailed off, her face crumpling. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Sophie, he's a manipulative bastard who's been playing you. And you've let him." "I didn't mean to," she cried, breaking down. For a moment, the only sound was her sobs. I stood there, fists clenched, trying to push past the storm of emotions. "This ends now," I said finally. "I don't care what it takes. You're cutting all ties with him, and you're going to therapy." She didn't argue, just nodded, her face buried in her hands. Downstairs, Lisa was waiting for me. "How did it go?" she asked hesitantly. "She's cutting ties with him," I said shortly. "But this isn't over." Lisa nodded, wringing her hands. "I'll call someone tomorrow. A counselor or—" "No," I interrupted. "I'm calling someone. You've done enough damage already." Lisa recoiled, and for a second, guilt pricked at me. But I pushed it aside. This wasn't the time for sympathy. Later that night, I sat in the kitchen with a bottle of bourbon, staring at my phone. My first instinct was to call the police. What David had done wasn't just immoral, it was criminal. But the thought of dragging Sophie into a legal mess stopped me. This needed to be handled carefully. I dialed my brother, Tom, instead. "Jim," he answered after a few rings. "What's up?" "You sound off." "I need to talk," I said, my voice thick with exhaustion. Tom listened as I spilled everything. By the time I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Jesus Christ, Jim," he finally said. I don't even know what to say." "Me neither," I admitted. "You need to report him," Tom said firmly. "What he's done, it's not just wrong, it's illegal." "I know," I said quietly. "And Sophie," he continued, "she's still a kid, Jim. She's been manipulated. She needs help." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I'm handling it." "Good. Don't let this bastard get away with it." After we hung up, I stared at the bourbon bottle for a long time. Tom was right. David couldn't just walk away from this. But I wasn't sure I was ready for the fallout. The morning after my call with Tom, I woke up to a house steeped in tension. Sophie's door remained closed, her silence as loud as any argument. Lisa was in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee, her eyes bloodshot. "You're not going to work?" she asked as I stepped in. "No," I said flatly, pouring myself a cup. "There's too much to deal with." Lisa nodded, not meeting my eyes. I spent the morning making calls. First, I found a therapist specializing in family trauma and booked an appointment for Sophie. Then I contacted a lawyer. If things escalated, I needed to know my options. By noon, I couldn't take the silence anymore. I headed upstairs and knocked on Sophie's door. "Come in," she said, her voice small. I opened the door to find her sitting at her desk, staring out the window. Her bed was unmade, and the room smelled faintly of the lavender candles she loved so much. "Pack a bag," I said. Her head whipped around, eyes wide. "What? Why?" "You're staying with Aunt Maggie for a while." She stood up, her face crumpling. "You're sending me away?" "I'm giving you space," I said firmly. "You need time to think about what's happened and start figuring out how to move forward. Right now, you can't do that here." Tears streamed down her face, but she didn't argue. She started throwing clothes into a duffel bag, her movements jerky and frantic. By mid-afternoon, Sophie was gone. I drove her to Maggie's myself, explaining as little as possible. Maggie didn't press for details, but her concerned glances told me she knew something was deeply wrong. When I returned home, the silence was oppressive. Lisa was in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. "She's gone," I said, dropping onto the couch. Lisa nodded, her expression unreadable. "Maybe that's for the best." "It is," I said. For a while, we just sat there. The air between us felt heavy, like a storm about to break. "You should have told me," I said finally, my voice low but firm. Lisa turned to me, her eyes filling with tears. "I know. I screwed up, Jim. I thought I was protecting you. Protecting her. Protecting us?" I laughed bitterly. "By lying? By letting her walk straight into this mess?" Her tears spilled over, but I didn't stop. "You had weeks to say something, weeks to stop this. And instead, you let it fester." Lisa broke down, burying her face in her hands. "I'm sorry. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to yell, to tell her how her inaction had nearly destroyed everything. But I couldn't bring myself to kick her while she was already crumbling. Instead, I got up and left the room. That evening, I sat in the garage with the lawyer's business card in one hand and a half-empty beer in the other. I was spiraling, and I knew it. Every step forward felt like sinking further into quicksand. I thought about Sophie, about how lost she'd looked when I dropped her off at Maggie's. I thought about Lisa, sobbing on the couch, and about David, probably sitting smugly in his living room, thinking he'd gotten away with it. The thought of him made my blood boil all over again. I grabbed my phone and texted Tom. "Me. I'm going to confront him. Again." "Tom, you sure that's a good idea?" "Me, no. But it's the only idea I've got." That night, I marched across the cul-de-sac and pounded on David's door. He answered in a t-shirt and jeans, his expression shifting from surprise to wary the moment he saw me. "Jim," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "We're talking," I said, pushing past him into his foyer. David closed the door behind me and turned, his hands in his pockets. "I told you everything yesterday. What else is there to say?" I stepped closer, my fists clenched. "You don't get to brush this off, David. You destroyed my family." "I didn't mean for it to happen," he said, his voice defensive. "You keep saying that," I growled. "But you knew who she was. You knew she was your daughter. And you still—" My voice broke with disgust. David looked away, guilt flickering across his face. "I made a mistake. I didn't think it would go this far." "This far?" I shouted. "You've traumatized her. You've shattered everything Lisa and I built." He flinched but didn't respond. "You're a predator," I said, my voice cold. "And you're going to pay for what you've done." David's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" "It's not a threat," I said. "It's a promise." Without waiting for his response, I turned and left, slamming the door behind me. Back home, Lisa was waiting in the living room, her eyes puffy and red. "How did it go?" she asked hesitantly. "He's a coward," I said, collapsing onto the couch. Lisa nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "What happens now?" I stared at her, exhaustion washing over me. "We pick up the pieces. Somehow." The question was whether there were enough pieces left to pick up. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sophie's tear-streaked face or Lisa's hollow expression. Worst of all, I kept replaying David's smug, defensive tone. He didn't seem scared. He didn't seem sorry. By morning, my exhaustion had turned into something darker. I needed more than just words. I needed action. The first thing I did was call the lawyer. "James Carter," I said when the receptionist picked up. "I'd like to set up a consultation about a possible legal case involving abuse and manipulation." They transferred me to a lawyer named Mark Fuller, who listened carefully as I explained the situation. David's relationship to Sophie, the messages, the photos. I kept my emotions in check, sticking to the facts. When I finished, Mark let out a long breath. "This is a complicated case," he said. "Legally, Sophie is an adult, which makes pursuing criminal charges tricky. But given the familial relationship, you might have grounds for a civil case, or we could explore reporting him under certain abuse statutes." I gripped the phone tighter. "What does that mean?" "It means it's not a slam dunk," Mark said, "but it's worth pursuing." "Do it," I said. I'll provide whatever you need. With the lawyer on board, I turned my attention to Sophie. I called Maggie and asked her to put Sophie on the line. "Hi, Dad," Sophie said when she picked up, her voice hesitant. "How are you holding up?" I asked, trying to sound calm. "I don't know," she admitted. "I'm just tired." I paused, searching for the right words. "I've talked to a lawyer," I said carefully. "We're going to make sure David pays for what he's done." Sophie was silent for a moment. "Is that really necessary?" she asked finally. I froze. "What?" "I mean, he didn't force me," she said quietly. "I made my own choices." Anger flared in my chest. "Sophie, you were manipulated. He used his position to take advantage of you. That's not a choice, it's abuse." Her voice wavered. "I don't know if I can handle more drama." "You don't have to," I said firmly. "I'll handle it, but you need to understand that what he did was wrong. He doesn't get to walk away from this." After a long pause, she whispered, "Okay." That afternoon, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, partly to clear my head and partly to keep an eye on David. I passed his house, noting the curtains drawn tight. Good. Let him hide. As I turned the corner, I ran into Susan, another neighbor who lived a few houses down. "Hey, Jim," she said, smiling. Then her face fell. "You look rough. Everything okay?" I forced a weak smile. "Just a lot going on?" Susan nodded sympathetically. "I heard Sophie's staying with Maggie for a bit." "Teenagers, huh?" I stiffened. "How'd you hear that?" "Oh, Lisa mentioned it when I ran into her yesterday," Susan said casually. "She said you guys were dealing with some family stuff." My stomach twisted. "What else did she say?" "Nothing specific," Susan said. "Just that it was a tough time." I nodded, forcing a polite goodbye. As I walked away, my mind raced. If Lisa was talking to neighbors, how long before rumors spread? That evening, I confronted Lisa. "Why are you talking to people about Sophie?" I demanded as soon as I walked in. Lisa looked up, startled. "I didn't say anything bad," she said defensively. Susan asked, and I just told her Sophie was staying with Maggie. "Do you realize how fast gossip spreads in this neighborhood?" I snapped. "I wasn't gossiping," Lisa protested. "You don't think this will get back to David?" I shot back. "You don't think he'll use it to twist the story?" Lisa flinched, her guilt written all over her face. "Keep your mouth shut," I said coldly. "Until this is over, no one needs to know anything." The next day, I received a call from Mark. "We've drafted a letter to David, notifying him of our intent to pursue legal action," he said. "We'll send it out tomorrow." "Good," I said, relief washing over me. But the relief didn't last. That night, as I was finishing dinner, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Unknown, let it go, Jim." My heart pounded as I stared at the screen. Was it David? One of his friends? Before I could respond, another text came through. "Unknown. You don't want to make this worse." I showed the messages to Lisa, who paled. "What does he mean by worse?" she whispered. "I don't know," I said. But my mind was already racing. If David thought he could intimidate me into backing off, he had another thing coming. The next morning, I called Mark again. "I'm being threatened," I said, forwarding him the texts. "Can we use this?" Mark's tone grew serious. "We'll document it, but you should also notify the police. This is harassment." "Will do," I said. I filed a report at the local station that afternoon, providing the texts and explaining the situation. The officer took notes, but his expression made it clear he wasn't hopeful. "We'll look into it," he said. That night, I sat by the window, watching the street outside. Every time a car passed, my muscles tensed. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about protecting my family. David had started a dangerous game, and I was ready to finish it. The next few days passed in a haze of tension. Sophie remained at Maggie's. Lisa barely spoke, and I couldn't stop thinking about the texts. Every creak of the floorboards or hum of a passing car felt like a threat. David had crossed too many lines, and I was done playing defense. Late one evening, my phone buzzed with a call from Sophie. "Dad?" Her voice was trembling. "Sophie, what's wrong?" I asked, immediately on edge. "He called me," she said, her words tumbling out. "David. He said he wants to meet. He said he has something important to tell me." My grip on the phone tightened. "What did you say?" "I told him no," Sophie said quickly. "But he sounded desperate." Desperate. It was the same word Lisa had used to describe him when I first learned about the affair. I didn't trust it. Block his number, I said firmly. And if he tries to contact you again, tell me immediately. Sophie agreed, but I could hear the unease in her voice. When I hung up, I sat in the kitchen for a long time, staring at my phone. David's manipulation wasn't just disgusting. It was relentless. He was trying to pull Sophie back in, and I needed to put a stop to it. The next day, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for lawyers or police reports. I was going to end this myself. I drove to David's house that afternoon, my hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. This time, I wasn't knocking. I pushed open his unlocked gate and pounded on his door. When he opened it, his face shifted from surprise to fear in an instant. "You and I are having a conversation," I said, stepping inside before he could protest. "Jim, look, I don't want any trouble," David stammered, backing into the hallway. "You've already got trouble," I snapped. "You crossed the line, David. You've destroyed my family. And now you're harassing my daughter." "I wasn't harassing her," he protested. I wanted to apologize. To explain." "Explain what?" I roared. "How you manipulated an 18-year-old girl. Your own daughter?" David flinched, his hands trembling. "It wasn't like that." "Then what was it like?" I demanded, stepping closer. He backed against the wall, his face pale. I cared about her." "You don't get to care about her," I spat. "You don't get to manipulate her, to use her, and then call it love. You're a predator, David." For a moment, the room was silent except for David's ragged breathing. Then he said something that stopped me cold. "She came to me first." My blood turned to ice. "What did you say?" I asked, my voice dangerously low. David's eyes darted nervously. "She reached out to me after she found out I was her father. She said she wanted to get to know me. She's the one who—" "Don't," I growled, stepping so close I could feel his breath. "Don't you dare try to blame this on her." "I'm not," he said quickly. "I'm just saying it wasn't all me." I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to hit him. "You're unbelievable." David seemed to sense how close he was to real danger. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Jim, listen. I'll stay away. I'll block her number. I'll move if I have to. Just don't do anything crazy." "Crazy?" I said, laughing bitterly. "You don't know the meaning of the word. But you're about to." I turned and walked out before I could do something I'd regret. That night, I sat in the dark living room, replaying everything David had said. The idea that Sophie had initiated contact with him didn't absolve him. It made his actions even worse. He should have protected her, set boundaries. Instead, he'd exploited her. Lisa came downstairs, her expression cautious. "Did you see him again?" she asked softly. "Yes," I said. She hesitated, then sat across from me. And he's a coward," I said. "He's trying to spin it like Sophie's the one who started this." Lisa's face crumpled. "Of course he is." "I'm not stopping," I said firmly. "I'm going to make sure he pays for what he's done." Lisa nodded, tears in her eyes. "I want that too." The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with lawyers, sessions with Sophie's therapist, and countless nights of restless sleep. Mark filed a civil suit against David, and the police began investigating him for possible charges under abuse statutes. Sophie slowly began to heal. Therapy was helping her unpack the manipulation she'd endured, and she started to see David for who he really was. As for Lisa and me, our relationship was fractured, but we were trying. The betrayal ran deep, but so did our shared history. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the sun set, Lisa reached over and took my hand. "I know I've made mistakes," she said softly, "but I want to fix this. I want to fix us." I looked at her, seeing the woman I'd loved for so many years and the stranger she'd become. "I don't know if we can," I admitted. "But you'll try?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded slowly. "I'll try." It wasn't forgiveness, and it wasn't resolution, but it was a start. The legal process dragged on, but eventually, David moved away. He avoided criminal charges, but the civil suit drained him financially and shattered his reputation. He lost everything. As for my family, we were still picking up the pieces. It wasn't perfect, and it might never be. But we were moving forward, one day at a time.